if people have some disagreement about how much animals matter or how much moral status they have, they might sometimes disagree about whether the principle is satisfied in a given case. But Beecham and I worked hard to reduce this problem of differing estimations of animals' moral status to a single principle. Together, the principles of social benefit require the prospect of a unique net benefit sufficient to justify anticipated harms to animals. And both champions of animal research and animal protectionists should be able to accept this demand. Let's consider a case now. The case is intended to illustrate how you might take the principles and think ethically about a proposed study. In this case, it's a study that already took place, but we have to imagine the point of view before we knew what would happen. It's an important case in which Moderna worked with the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases to develop a vaccine for COVID in 2020, when the pandemic was raging and there was enormous uncertainty. Moderna actually began human safety testing at the same time as NIAID began an infection challenge study involving 24 rhesus macaque monkeys. An infection challenge study is one in which the subjects, whether animals or humans, are intentionally given a disease or exposed to a disease. For example, intranasally given COVID. Let's see what else, sorry. Okay. So, was the first principle, no alternative method, actually met in this case? You might say no. After all, the Moderna started the early stage clinical trial with humans without even waiting for the animal study. It suggests it didn't matter. However, if the animal study had yielded negative results, like this doesn't look promising, that might have led to a judgment that it's not appropriate to go to a larger clinical trial with human subjects. So in that sense, it might have been quite necessary. What about expected net benefit? Well, remember where we were. The benefit of an effective vaccine at that time would be so great that even a modest chance of success would seem to have exceeded the costs to humans. Was there sufficient value to justify harm? I think most would judge that there was. There was sufficient prospect of a quite massive benefit to humanity to justify the regrettable harms to the animal subjects, which, as far as we know, include 2 injections of vaccine or placebo, strong exposure to COVID, 3 blood draws, 4 nasal swabs, 3 lung washings with saline, which I think is done to measure the amount of disease in the lungs. Some monkeys, I assume, became ill. All were killed at the end of the experiment in order to do a lung pathology, and maybe in some cases for euthanasia, I'm not sure. And there might have been some other harms because we don't know exactly how they were treated in their living conditions. That information was not available to my co-author and me. Okay, we're going to come back to this case. Now for the principles of animal welfare. The first one has a sort of boring or obvious sounding name, no unnecessary harm. Who could be opposed to that? Right? But it's important in practice to think about ways how not to include any harms that really aren't necessary for the good science. So animal subjects must not be harmed unless a particular harm is necessary for and morally justified by scientific purposes, and assuming other principles are also met. The relevant harms, though, shouldn't be only those involved in scientific procedures. They should include anything that affects the animal's quality of life, their housing, the way they're handled, how they're transported if they are. Second principle is called basic needs. Animal subjects' basic needs must be met in the conduct of studies unless failure to meet specific basic needs is necessary for and morally justified by scientific purposes. And by basic needs, we mean what's ordinarily required for a decent life for the kind of animal in question. So as far as I can see, these animals have a decent life, or they might have a decent life. Now, you might very reasonably ask, why on earth should we be responsible for looking after the basic needs of research animals? Consider, there are squirrels in my backyard and my front yard, like a lot of homeowners. I shouldn't harm them, I'll grant you that, but I don't have to make sure they get enough to eat. And I don't have to protect them from predators. It would be crazy to think that I have to look after them as if they were my pets. They're not. So if I only shouldn't harm the squirrels, why should we owe taking care of the basic needs of research animals? The answer is, I think the principle is justified by way of the special relationship between the human personnel and animal subjects. I have no particular relationship to the squirrels who happen to come close to my house. So the idea is that in relationships where some are made totally dependent on others' continued care, failure to meet basic needs is harm or is tantamount to harm. If, for example, you bring a baby home from the hospital, a newborn baby, and don't feed the baby, you're starving them. Terrible example, but clear, I think. If you have a pet dog and you refuse to walk the dog or make sure the dog gets some real exercise, you're sort of harming them. If not, it's as bad as harm. It's something you owe them more than that. We propose a list of basic needs: nutritious food and clean water, safe shelter, adequate stimulation, exercise, and opportunities for species typical functioning, enough rest for health, veterinary care as needed, access to compatible members of the same species or any other social group members, freedom from significant experiential harm such as pain, distress, or suffering, freedom from disease, injury, or disability, freedom of movement with adequate space. And I noticed that the Canadian Council has some requirements that seem sort of in the same neighborhood, even though they're using different language. They say, animals should be healthy and express species-typical behavior. They should neither experience negative affective states nor display behavioral signs of chronic anxiety or depression. Now here's a controversial item that we noted without committing to whether it belonged on the list of basic needs: avoidance of premature death. By premature death, I mean a death that occurs, whether for a person or an animal, when that individual could reasonably be expected to have a decent life, decent quality of life. That's premature death. Is premature death a harm to an animal? Is avoiding that a basic need? We officially left it open. I believe the answer is yes, especially with sentient animals who are fairly complex cognitively, emotionally, and socially. That's not to say it's just as much of a harm as it would be if one of us died prematurely, where our whole life plans would be cut off. But I do think, in my humble opinion, I do think premature death is a harm, and so it should be considered. The final principle in our framework is upper limits to harm. The other 5 principles permit harm when necessary for justified scientific objectives. And they set no limit on how much is okay. And there is no limit in US policy and in the policy, I think, of most countries that regulate animal research. So all of the following are permitted in principle and at least once in practice: induced terminal heart attacks in dogs, induced third-degree burns and severe lung injury in conscious sheep. Learned helplessness induced by inescapable electric shock in rats. That's a lot of harm. We think there should be limits. And so does the European Union, which wrote in its directive of 2010, quote, "The performance of procedures that result in severe pain, suffering, or distress that is likely to be long-lasting and cannot be ameliorated should be prohibited." Notice they mention procedures. This point should not only apply to procedures. If desolate housing conditions would cause severe long-term suffering in a monkey, for example, that exceeds the limit. That's excessive harm, as I understand it. So this is the way we say it. It's a very short sentence. Animal subjects must not be caused to endure severe suffering for a lengthy period of time. You may have already noticed that, like the EU statement, it's vague in two places. Severe suffering and lengthy. We could have tried to define it and operationalize it, but I think it would have gotten into the weeds and led to problems, and I would rather trust good, smart people to try to operationalize it if they accept the idea. I think the idea is sound. And Tom Beecham and I find it plausible, given the assumption that sentient animals have at least some moral status and are not simply our tools to be used. We also, in the book, left open the possibility of extremely rare exceptions. These might be in public health emergencies, where it seems like there's no way to deal adequately with the problem without violating this principle. I personally am doubtful that that actually would be justified, but it might be, and if so, any exception should be carefully documented, justified in a way that's open to public review. Back to our case. What about no unnecessary harm in the testing on the monkeys of the COVID vaccine? At first glance, it might seem that all the harms were scientifically necessary. But at second glance, I ask, was killing the monkeys really necessary? Yes, it's helpful for lung pathologies, but there are other ways of telling whether monkeys have COVID. Now, maybe some of them were killed because they were about to suffer too much, and it was a kindness. On the other hand, pain medications or sedatives can reduce suffering associated with COVID. So I'm not sure this principle was met, even though the production of this vaccine was an incredible boon to humanity. The result is awesome, but it might have been possible to reach the same result with less harm. What about basic needs? Unfortunately, my co-author and I just couldn't get enough information. It just wasn't presented in the relevant publications, so sorry, I can't help with that too much. Upper limits to harm. Most of the harms do not seem very severe. The lung washings, however, what I assume would be at least moderately stressful. But I would also like to know how much the monkeys who developed COVID actually did suffer. And was there a way of avoiding great suffering if it occurred? So, by the way, I'm not trying to render a final judgment about this case. It's intended to illustrate engaging the principles as a way of thinking ethically about a particular proposed study. It also illustrates how messy this can be. Unfortunately, with this sort of work, sometimes it's very hard to answer questions that seem ethically really important. The 6 principles imply a decision tree, which I'll walk us through. We should ask, does the proposed animal study offer unique social benefit? If not, if there's a viable alternative, use the alternative. If so, does it offer the prospect of a net benefit to humanity? If so, is this prospect important enough to justify harming the animals in the ways anticipated? If so, does the proposed study avoid unnecessary harm? If not, maybe it can be modified so it meets this principle. If so, will the animal's basic needs be met, except we're incompatible with scientific objectives? And if so, will the animals avoid severe, persisting suffering? So you need a green light with all these questions to proceed. Now I want to go back in time, in a way back in time, because this framework, the 3 R's, was proposed a very, very long time ago. But it's also the present time because it's still dominating. The 3 R's framework, presented in Russell and Birch's Principles of Humane Experimental Technique. It's so old it was published before I was born. And yet it continues to enjoy nearly unquestioned status in mainstream biomedicine. It calls for replacing sentient animals where possible, a principle I mentioned before, reducing the number of subjects to the minimum necessary for statistical adequacy. And you might have noticed there were 24 monkeys used in the case I described. There weren't 100. And refining techniques to minimize pain and distress. This was a great advance in promoting animal welfare, but it's not adequate today. Unlike the approach that Beecham and I have proposed, the 3 R's do not acknowledge that depriving laboratory animals of basic needs is an important kind of harm. They don't set any limit on how much harm is permissible. And maybe most importantly, they don't consider which scientific objectives are worth pursuing and which means to pursuing them are justified in light of their social importance, costs to humans, and anticipated harms to animals. Now I'm going to back up just briefly into ethical theory for a moment, make one distinction. I'd like to distinguish 2 different questions that we can ask as ethicists or just as people thinking about ethics. The ideal question is something like this. Assuming people will be reasonable, well-informed, and committed to doing the right thing, what's the most ethical approach, or what should I do? Assuming, for example, that there's some disaster, humanitarian disaster, and you recognize an obligation to contribute, you could say, well, if everyone recognizes this obligation, everyone in a similar situation to me, what's my fair share? So if everyone's doing the right thing, what's my fair share? Or you could ask, I know lots of people won't contribute anything, even though they could. Maybe I should give more than my fair share in this messy situation, right? Or, an example from my own country, you may be aware that our healthcare system has a lot of problems with delivery and finance. It's extremely inefficient in the United States. And since I was in graduate school, experts have recognized the need for major reform to make it more cost-effective and more equitable to achieve universal access. Okay, so suppose you're President Obama, a little bit back in time, and you're thinking, I've got the Congress now, pretty cooperative, right? What can I pass? You might think the best system, lots of studies suggest, is Medicare for all, or a single-payer system. In other words, national health insurance that's publicly funded. It turns out to be much more efficient than the American system, and it's much more equitable and just. But that's ideal theory. The question is, what would be the best thing if everyone who has input would be acting rationally, well-informed, and ethically? But knowing that that's not the case, what's the best thing I can pass? Or what's the best thing Congress can pass? And then I can sign it. And so something came into being called Obamacare, which was a modest reform of the US's healthcare system. And it's far from ideal, but it was better. And if he had insisted on the ideal, we wouldn't have had any reform. So I just want to use that to highlight the distinction. All right, so I've already, in effect, talked about non-ideal theory. Taking into account people's actual interests and their beliefs, how they're likely to behave, what is the best approach that's reasonably achievable? Given gridlock and biases and entrenched interests, I believe non-ideal theory is better for making real-world progress in many cases. But ideal theory is needed for knowing what would be fully ethical or justified. I don't know about Beecham, but I consider the 6 Principles framework a work in non-ideal theory. Represents an attempt to bridge the chasm between the animal protection community and the animal research community in a way that hopefully nearly everyone could agree is acceptable. All right, some possible advantages of our model and a conclusion. Recent decades have shown, or have seen, growing concern about animal protection. Certainly in my lifetime, moral vegetarianism went from absolutely fringe status to pretty mainstream, even if a minority. In my country, there have been things like animal exhibits in zoos have been discontinued, dolphin exhibits have been discontinued, certain kinds of fighting involving dogs and chickens have been outlawed. These all reflect public growing more concerned about animal protection. When it comes to research, Americans are ambivalent, much more ambivalent than they were a few decades ago. Brazilians, based on what I recently read, at least a small majority tends to support important animal testing, but not basic research involving animals. So Brazilians too apparently are somewhat ambivalent. But in many countries, protections of animal subjects haven't evolved much since the 1980s. Today, I think we need a framework that reflects awareness about animal research science, including its limits, and competence in animal ethics. And I think animal care committees, if at all possible, should have an ethicist with competence in animal ethics. That could really change a lot of discussions, and I think in a healthy way. So here are some possible advantages of the 6 Principle framework. Seeing common ground in core values might foster more constructive communication among parties who are inclined to disagree and sometimes don't even want to talk to each other. Implementing the principles of social benefit would mean much better science, much more promising, probably far fewer studies approved, but more successful translation. Implementing the principles of animal welfare would promote the objective of decent lives for animal subjects. And it's much harder to criticize the use of animals if you have to acknowledge that overall their lives are worth living and are decent. Better translation and better animal welfare could increase public trust. And finally, adopting the framework would permit policy changes to proceed in a principled manner, which is not how it works, at least in my country. In my country, occasionally there's a change in relation to the most recent public relations disaster, which is not the optimal way, I think, of making policy. Obrigado pela sua atenção. And that's all I got for Portuguese.
Bom, vamos lá, vamos ouvir aqui quem gostaria de fazer alguma pergunta pro David. Hora de abrir aqui para vocês. Vou levar um. Só. David, some questions for you, okay?
So
If you can...
Dá para ouvir? So thank you so much for your talk. I really do appreciate the framework that seeks try to get into agreement different communities. And my question, you said that you agree that animals have some moral status. This is given. And I'm thinking about Immanuel Kant's famous phrase, he who is cruel to an animal is also cruel to a human being. Of course, this is criticized as seeing the animal as an instrument, but I don't think about this aspect here. I'm thinking that Kant also is looking about the character of the agent, right? I become a worst human being when I am cruel with the animals. So do your framework take this feature into account in any of these of your principles or not? Of course, you have social benefit, but I'm thinking, do you take individual moral agency into account in your model or not?
Not explicitly.
Please.
I think you should talk into the microphone.
On the microphone.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Not explicitly, but I would hope that the framework is consistent with the point that you just made. I do like the idea that behaving ethically, including avoiding cruelty, is not only good for the possible victims of cruelty, but in some way good for us. But even if it's not, I think there's adequate reason to avoid cruelty. And the principle of upper limits, in a way, is intended to avoid what would amount to cruelty.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for your question.
Mais alguém? Vamos checar aqui. Não? Ali, ó. Por favor.
In Portuguese?
Português ou inglês? Não está funcionando.
Okay. Just a curiosity, since we have no more questions popping up, do you know by any chance if there is any kind of study going on regarding a creation, for some cases, a synthetic tissue, so you can avoid or limit like the use of animals for research?
Yes, some of those alternatives on the list involved synthetic creations that can substitute for testing toxicity, maybe also testing efficacy. One example that's a somewhat older alternative is a kind of synthetic skin, which is useful for testing toxicity. And where it's effective, there would be no reason to test that on animals before going to humans. That's a good example, yeah. But there are others where it's not exactly synthetic, but grown from stem cells. And one remarkable potential here is that you can have more individualized or personalized medicine in which a particular individual who is having medical problems relating to the functioning of some organ might have something like that organ or something that functions like it developed from their own stem cells in a way that's more likely to be compatible with their body than something derived from a different source. But I have to be careful to repeat that I'm not an expert on the science. Thank you for your question.
Mais alguém aqui? Não? David, we receive here a question from Marta from Washington, and thank you very much for the extraordinary presentation and for sharing this important contribution for the ethics of animals protection with us. Could you please clarify what the impact of your approach would be if it were developed as an ideal theory?
Repeat the last bit.
As an ideal theory. Theory.
Oh, I heard the last bit, but the beginning of the question, what effect?
What effect? You can check here.
Okay, sure.
She sent to us the impact.
Oh. Hello, Marta. Thank you. Thank you for your question and your kind words. I wonder, maybe the question is, what do I think ideal theory would look like here? Do you think that's the question?
Something like this.
As opposed to non-ideal?
Yes.
Well, for me, ideal would be more strict. My view about the moral status of animals is it's hard to summarize in sound bites. It's a little bit complicated, but let's say it's a minority view, but I think one that's pretty well justified in the light of taking into account our human biases, our conflict of interest in considering our relations to animals, and the most plausible basis for why we think all human beings matter, which I think is better understood in terms of our capacity to have interests based on our sentience than any other factor. So in ideal theory, at least if it were mine, in some sense, there would be an equal presumption against harming non-humans, because I don't think species itself is relevant to moral status. I think it's an illusion. On the other hand, it is complicated, because I do think the ties of the human community also bring in special obligations that justify even stronger protections. And among sentient beings, those who have substantial self-awareness over time and life plans and projects and so on have special long-term interests. Long story short, I think those justify rights in a sense that I don't think apply to all sentient animals. So again, it's nuanced and complicated. Maybe the short answer is, I think ideal theory would protect animals even more than this framework, but would have zero chance of acceptance by the biomedical community. At least in the foreseeable future among the scientists I know. And also, applied to our case, I think the presumption against harming monkeys at all for human benefit would be very strong. And we would have to look at such possibilities as, well, maybe going straight to human volunteers. Radically would be with challenge studies. If they give really good informed consent, there is some talk about this in bioethics, and some bioethicists defended challenge studies involving humans, partly in the race against time. But even if you didn't have challenge studies, there were so many health professionals who were being exposed to COVID that testing a vaccine with them and then giving a placebo to others, I think might have been able to bring about the desired information in a more or less satisfactory way. In brief, though, there would be much stronger presumptions to using the monkeys in ideal theory. But it's not what I'm proposing to the world or the animal research community, because I know it's not ready for that. And plus, I might be wrong. I mean, one should be suspicious of one's own views if not that many people agree with you.
Okay. So, David, thank you very much for you.
Great pleasure.
For your
Oh, yes.
You have one?
Good, good.
We have more one here. Sorry.
First of all, I want to thank you for your presentation. It's wonderful. And this subject is very important to around the world, even in Brazil, because, you know, some companies maybe, I'm not sure this, I'm not right, but I believe maybe continue doing the research with animals. Even with this law, I believe. My question is, I'm studying in an important program in Mackenzie University, and the major subject now it's about human science. And sometimes, not sometimes, but yes, you can see how the right science, rational science, is in front of the human science. So, in your research, what can you see the important human science about this specific subject with relation is bioética, for example.
I'm not sure what you mean by humans.
On the microphone, please.
I'm not sure what you mean by human science. Do you mean like biological science with human subjects?
Yes.
Okay, and
Because we are talking about humans.
yes.
Research. So, I believe it is my question. With this has a relation with research, human science, in your opinion? I don't know if
no,
you
I think
understand my
this,
question.
well, I'll try to, I'm trying to, I think our framework takes for granted a lot of agreement about the treatment of human subjects in research. It's a pretty well established framework of protections. There's much less agreement about animals. So we focused there, and we mostly assumed that the framework for human subjects experimentation was more or less correct. I don't think anything we said in our framework calls for major changes to the human framework. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I understand.
Okay, thank you for your question. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, David, thank you very much for the contribution here.
Thank you, everyone, for staying with the long pause and for your attention. Appreciate it.
Okay, great. And we have here to tell you thank you for your participation here.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Ok. Bom, e nós vamos encerrar as atividades de hoje do Congresso de Bioética nesse primeiro dia. Então a gente quer agradecer a participação de todos. Muito obrigado. A gente inicia amanhã as nossas atividades às 9 horas. Ok? Toda a programação está disponível para vocês no site. Ali, para quem não acessou o site ainda, tem um banner na frente do auditório com QR Code. Só escanear ele que a gente vai ter acesso a todas as programações. Tá bom? Obrigado, boa noite a todos e estamos encerrando a nossa noite.